Dear 1968, I am sure this anniversary will be an important one for you, bringing up lots of personal reflection. Anniversaries are like that. They beg us to move forward while looking back. They regenerate all the cells that we had hoped to regenerate. They just keep coming back in a kind of flood of memories and an echo of hopes. Personally, I, Donna, want to congratulate you for being a magnificent effervescence, a really superb effervescence, almost as good as a fine perfume that lasts so long it just doesn't quite get out of the air. Or maybe a bubble machine that delights children in the park for longer than any bubble ever should. You might even have become to me like one of those great giant bubble machines, you know, the kind that people pay for the bubbler to make the bubbles, and they get so big, and the children go crazy, and then they pop. Now, some of the bubbles last longer than others of the bubbles, and you see them in places you're really not supposed to see them, and you can't even pay for because the bubbler has somehow disappeared. You run around with your money in your hand wanting to pay for the music and the bubble, but there's no bucket in which to put it. And of course, you weren't just an effervescence. You were also Pussy Riot Plus. You were Golden Calf Plus. You were an Occupy. You were a Stop Nuclear War. You were Student Power. You didn't even know all the things that you were. You were anti-war. And you were love is love is love, love is love is love. So I asked a lot of people to tell me what the 60s meant to them, and they all kind of said either one of two things. I said, you have to give me a bullet now. And the bullet was either love, sex, and rock and roll, or love, drugs, and rock and roll. And I thought that the message people had kind of gotten out of control a little bit. You, by the way, were not the New Sanctuary movement. You were not a movement run by immigrants or for immigrants, and you were not the Black Lives Matter or Black Lives movement. You were white. You really didn't get the gay thing. God knows you didn't get the woman thing. Let's hear it once again for Stokely Carmichael, who thought that the place for women in our movement was prone. That's not a nice thing to say. I spent most of the 60s typing for men. So when they gave their speeches, they could either go to the student newspaper or elsewhere. But you were an international movement. René Lévesque in Quebec spoke about the Révolution Tranquille, saying that it was a time when people there took over control for their life, and they started Hydro-Quebec. Well, Hydro-Quebec had been around since 1944, but they really took ownership of the way electricity was managed there. And the other thing that I always remember as a phrase from the 60s is, I'm just doing my own thing, right? There's a kind of profound individualism and localism to it. And Lévesque, as one of the great leaders in Canada of the movement, had one major problem with this gorgeous hydroelectric, owned by the people, power plant. It rerouted the waters through the ancestral lands, and people got really upset about it. And as I turn to be more reflective about your anniversary, I will say that that's really what 1968 did. It upended the status quo in a way that scared the you-know-what out of the status quo, and in a way, that's how you've lasted, by making people afraid that you might really enjoy love or sex or rock and roll or doing your own thing. You see, you scared the supervisors of personal and sexual repression so much that they're still trying to put your genius back into a box. You also threatened the status quo so much with your arrogance. Don't trust anyone over 30. I mean, really. Or nothing like us ever was. If one of my kids said that to me, I would be very upset. You threatened the status quo so much with your arrogance that they're still working to smash your bubble before any more people look at it and like it. So what are we to make of you now? We must surely thank you from the bottoms of our hearts for having real and permanent cultural power. You still have a gleam in your eye about love, sex, and rock and roll. You actually are in favor of self-medication. And I just want to go into that moment. The only institutional change that I can really see is the legalization of marijuana. There are other things that have happened and continue to try to happen, but it's pretty much status quo because of the terrible threat to those ancestral waters that happened. When we look at what really lasted, we can say that marijuana was legalized. And that is certainly a form of self-medication. But wouldn't the people who want to do their own thing also want to self-medicate? And what is it about doctors? I know I've got all of our doctors in the house this morning. I think we only have 3, but why do doctors get to be in charge of medication for people who want to be out from under repression? So there is a kind of victory there that is small, but I think philosophically interesting. I also think that the way in which the movement was run from the middle class and white men were basically in charge of it is really another difference. Because for better or worse, middle-class people and white men have a hard time getting control of movements today. And I don't think that's finally very helpful, even though it was certainly time for people to be in charge in a more generous and diverse way. So listen to this do your own thing and self-leadership, self-directed leadership, diverse leadership come together. The park across the street, Washington Square Park, had a meeting about some future planning, and the woman who opened the meeting said, quote, "Experts are good, but we wanted to hear from the people who were going to use the park." That's a value that is very much in multiple movements. We wanted to hear from the people who were going to use the park. You also have that movement in the disability rights movement, where people say nothing for us without us. We certainly see that in the immigration movement, where we insist that the people who are impacted have as much power in the organization as the people who are trying to help them. We certainly see that in the BLM movement and its ancillary movements, where people say, it needs to be about us, because it is about us. So there was something fundamentally paternalistic in the 60s with the leadership being middle class and male. And that change has happened. But what are you supposed to do if you are white and male? Turn off your cell phone. What are you supposed to do to express agency, the very agency that you're trying to have other people have? I think that's a very important question right now, because American movements, as my historian husband will be glad to tell you at length and with great detail, American movements work when the middle class gets involved. They don't work from the edges. They work when the middle class gets involved, which is to say, really involved. People don't get involved in movements where they don't have anything they can say without being told to be quiet. So I wanted to say something more about and I'm going to give René Lévesque most of the time, but there's also a wonderful French leader, which you all know, a man named Daniel Cohn-Bendit, or known as Danny the Red. And he said that he had been dreading for his entire life, I want to get the quote, he's been dreading the 50th anniversary of 1968 forever, in the same way that I think some married couples dread their 50th anniversary forever. I mean, it comes, and God, it's a great accomplishment, but it's also, what's the meaning of it? So Cohn-Bendit said he swore he'd never give an interview about the 50th anniversary, because it was his hope that the anniversary would be so inclusive that they will be still not counting on people like him to give the interviews, that other people would be involved. But then he agreed to one interview, and this is what he said. He said what 1968 was finally all about was the ancient regime versus youth. Now, 50 years later, being an elder myself, I really don't like to think of my life as elder versus youth. I like to think of my life as one of mutual mentoring, where I teach and I learn almost simultaneously. Bendit also said that it was a system versus a movement. And I think many of us are wondering how to make that movement and other movements systemic, as in an election this fall. I don't think we're just interested in bubbles anymore. He also argues that the other big theme in 68 was there were a lot of heroes and there were a lot of villains, the good and bad. And if the movement for queer people has taught us anything, it's watch out for that binary. Watch out for any binary, because the villains and the heroes are often in the same body. Put differently, the heroes and the villains are often in the same body. That is a maturing perspective from 1958. When you say things like nothing like us ever was, I mean, seriously, love? That is not loving to say that. That is preposterous generational imperialism. Bendit also says that 68 was finally about order versus anarchy. And boy, you feel that in the rising up, at least of the American ancestral people, and how much they need order and think order is good, even in what Andre calls a baby country, a child country like the United States. We're only a couple hundred years old, and we refer to our past as though it was the biggest past that ever happened. And how could that possibly be? And finally, Bendit argues that 68 was about power and counterpower, not one kind of power and another kind of power, but an uprising of power from below. These things matter to who we're going to become next as we mature 50 years from now. So I'll close with a story. I'm up in Johnstown, New York, at a State Council of Churches meeting about how churches can help local economies revive. And it's kind of a dull meeting, but it's a really beautiful part of the world. And I go out for a walk along their bike path, and there is the most gorgeous field of red raspberries, as big as this whole side of the room. And they're all completely ripe, and there's nobody there. And there's a giant sign that says, "No trespassing." No picking. And it says, "Pickers will be shot." And I'm remembering Cohn-Bendit saying that his favorite slogan from 1968 is, "Nothing is forbidden." So I walk through the rows, and I think, maybe I'll just make sure they're okay. So I ate one, and it was really okay, and then I ate two, and I had quite a few, and then I left, because I didn't want to be shot, but also it was stealing, It was not my crop. And I decided to come back the next day with a bucket. So I'm in a small bucket, not a big bucket, a small bucket. I get in the field, and I start picking the raspberries, and I'm going to bring them home, and I'm going to show them off, and I'm going to feed everybody, and we're all going to be happy. And it'll be a good story. And sure enough, a man comes up in a red pickup truck, and he comes out, and I'm kind of far down in the field, just picking the best berries I can find. And he walks down towards me. He was not carrying a shotgun. I thought that was good news. And he said, "Hey, how you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing great." And I said, "Yeah, I picked some of your berries." And he said, "Oh, great. Let me go get some more buckets. How many do you want?" And then he said, "Raspberry fields forever." And he was probably my age in 1968, and I was probably his age in 1968. And in all of this analysis of 1968 that I read thinking about today, what for me was true was the joy. It was fun. Now, when you're that age, it's easier to have fun. But I want to talk more about power and anarchy and movements and systems. I want to remember the joy and wish 1968 a happy anniversary, because our life goes on in endless song above earth's lamentations, and we are going to sing it now. But the way we sing here is so often so full of joy. I mean, why not? Amen.